or good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this new CICA webinar on the World Bank Be Ready 2025 report, previously called Doing Business, as you may know. Before diving into the topic with our guest, I would just like to remind a few housekeeping rules to just keep your microphones off during the presentations of our guest. We will have the Q&A session at the end of this webinar, so at the end of the presentations, and you will be able to either ask your questions in the chat or directly by raising your hand orally at the end of the session. So this webinar is recorded. If you want to see it again, it will be available on CICA's YouTube channel in a few days, and don't hesitate to share it to your networks, of course. So now I'm very pleased to welcome the World Bank today for this new webinar episode. Just for a bit background information, CICA did a mission in Washington, D.C. early March, and this is where we had the opportunity to meet with the Global Indicators team led by Jayashri. So thank you very much for meeting with us early March. It was really interesting, and we were able to discuss how this report is really useful for the construction sector, especially with the challenges that we have right now in terms of permitting issue. So I'm really pleased to be able to have this presentation today. So I will introduce the two guest speakers. So we will have Jayashri Srinivasan. So sorry if I'm misspelling or mispronouncing your names. Thank you. She is a regulatory specialist at the World Bank's Global Indicators Group, where she focuses on regulatory analysis, data, and research to support private sector development. She leads the business location topic in the Business Ready report, working on areas like land administration, environmental permitting, and built environment regulations. She also heads the Building Green initiative, which analyzes global building energy codes. Her work centers on developing indicators and policy guidance to help governments improve business environments and promote sustainable urban development. So thank you for being here today. And as second guest speaker, we have Victoria Ereshenko. She's an economist with the World Bank's Business Ready project, leading the utility services topic with a focus on energy, water, and digital sectors. She previously led the Getting Electricity Indicator in the Doing Business project and has contributed to research on trade and business reforms. And her background includes role in international research, consulting, and development organizations across multiple countries. So thank you both for being here today. And without further ado, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and big welcome to everybody from CICA, and really appreciate the opportunity, Andine, to present this to your audience. And I hope that, not just talking here, that, we are able to disseminate this further by sharing the recording of this event so that, more of your CICA members are able to understand what is it that we measure and, are able to kind of interact and engage with us further. I'm going to share my slide deck. A second. Are you able to see the screen?
Yes, perfect.
Okay, perfect. So once again, a big thank you. I'll be sharing selected findings from Be Ready 2025 on the business location topic with a particular focus on construction permitting and environmental compliance. I'll concentrate on what these patterns mean in practice for contractors working across jurisdictions where rules are clear, where processes are predictable, and where implementation gaps still create risk. So what exactly is Be Ready, right? So very quickly, I want to give an overview. It's the World Bank's flagship assessment of business and investment climate. In the 2025 edition, which was published in December last year, it covered 101 countries across all regions and income groups. What makes it particularly useful is that it not only looks at laws on paper, it also looks at public services and transparency, how systems function in practice. For this audience, that matters because the construction market is shaped not just by the code, but also whether information is accessible, right? Where the agencies coordinate and whether approvals are delivered in a predictable way. And so what do we measure? So we in the topic that I lead in business location, we assess building permits, environmental permits, and related zoning and land use systems across three dimensions. First, rules on the books, right? Are the regulatory requirements there? Second, services and transparency. Can firms find information and interact digitally with government? And third, real world efficiency. How long does the process take and what does it cost? For contractors, this framework is useful because project risk can emerge in all three places, right? A market may have reasonably modern regulations, but weak transparency. Or it may have digital portals, but poor interagency coordination. So the key message throughout this presentation is that regulatory quality and operational usability do not always move together. One of the clearest findings is that the core safety mechanisms um, are widely established, right? So most economies have formal requirements around inspections, occupancy permits, and enforcement codes, enforcement authority. 77% of economies that we measured in Be Ready 2025 have a unified national building code. So in broad terms, legal architecture exists. But the weaker point is accountability. Only 31% of economies provide a formal route to appeal a building permit decision. For international contractors, this is a very practical concern. It means that in many markets, when a permit decision is inconsistent, delayed, or disputed, then if there may be no transparent administrative pathway to resolve it. So the challenge is less the absence of standards and more the lack of predictable recourse. So the adoption implementation gap is even more visible and building energy efficiency. In many regions, economies have adopted mandatory energy efficiency requirements, but verification lags well behind. So in other words, the standards may exist, but the system to check compliance is much weaker. Green building incentives are also limited in some places. For contractors, this means two things, right? First, regulatory expectation around energy performance is spreading. And second, enforcement is uneven, which creates a less level playing field. Firms investing in compliance may be operating in markets where verification is inconsistent, and that creates uncertainty and uneven competition. And we see that the gap between mandatory and standards and enforcement is largest in Sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, Latin America, and OECD high income. On zoning and land use, the overall picture is more positive. Most economies have strong baseline coverage for infrastructure access, land use maps, and natural resource protections. This is encouraging because it supports more predictable project planning, right? So the practical takeaway here is that, for the front end of site selection and project planning is often better structured than the permit process itself. At the same time, in markets where hazard mapping is incomplete, firms still need to do a lot of additional due diligence, rather than assuming that the official mapping system fully captures project risk. And moving to environmental permitting frameworks, these are also, there is broad coverage, right? It's broadly established. Across regions, requirements for pollution control, wastewater, waste management, and water extraction is common, but the strength and consistency of these frameworks vary. Some regions show very strong coverage across all components, while others are more uneven, especially on pollution and wastewater requirements. So again, broad message is that environmental regulation, it's not that environmental regulation is absent, it's that the depth and consistency varies quite a lot. For professionals, contractors working across borders, this means environmental due diligence cannot simply rely on a simple assumption of equivalence across markets, even when permit categories appear to be similar. And if you see that, there are some regions, for instance, Europe and Central Asia, there is 100% coverage of, like, in terms of, cert permits being required. But we see that it's lax in South Asia, for instance, the numbers are lower. And so there is still quite a bit of variance, right? And depending on what exactly is required. And what's also interesting is that, we look at permits required, and we also measure whether, what is whether a qualified professional is by law is required for conducting an environmental impact assessment. And strangely enough, that, we find that one would think that this would be the case, right, across all economies, but that's not true. That in South Asia and LAC and in East Asia and Pacific, also we see cases where this is not required in the law, right? So there is variance of what kind of professional is actually conducting the environmental impact assessment. Um, and an important detail for industry is what happens when there's disagreement, right? So when I'm talking about environmental permitting, I'm talking about environmental permitting in construction. So, and all of what we cover under environmental permitting, especially only under construction, right? And I know this is a pain point for a lot of contractors, right? So, formal appeal rights are common, but out of court mechanisms such as arbitration, mediation, remain rare across all regions. In most cases, places, the court system remains dominant and often the only route. This matters because courts are usually slower, more expensive, and less specialized than administrative or alternate dispute channels. So, from a project delivery perspective, even when a formal recourse exists, it may not provide the kind of timely, resolution that in the construction industry that they need to kind of keep the project moving. So we basically say, can the decision be appealed, and what kind of out of court mechanisms exist? And and there is uh, very little out of court mechanisms, as you can see. The numbers are very low across all regions, and that is a worrisome trend, right? I mean, in the sense that we want these mechanisms to exist rather than all of them being appealed and going through the court. Um, then I go back and forth between what matters in building permits and what matters in environmental permits, right? Because we measure all of these elements. Occupancy permit digitization lags behind building permits. So what we see here is now I'm talking about core building, right? So when we turn to digitization or digitalization, one clear pattern emerges. So digitization is stronger at the front end rather than at the back end. So what does this mean, right? Means more than half of economies that we measure in Be Ready 2025 can issue building permits online, but fewer than this, like 38%, can issue occupancy permits online. So Latin America and the Caribbean shows the starkest contrast. For practitioners, this is important because the project may be efficient through the whole early approval phase, but then slows down for the final legal gateway before occupation or operation. The existence of a digital building permit platform should not be taken to mean that the full process is end to end. So, and the thing is, there's also this whole issue about occupancy permits, right? And I haven't covered that in the slide, but we have that in our data. That it might be that there's also an issue of occupancy permit not being required in a subset of economies at all by regulatory in the regulatory framework. And so what does this mean? And this is something that we've been measuring right from doing business days, right? The existence of occupancy permits in the regulation, and also whether this can be, obtained online. So this is can be a bottleneck because, it doesn't signal to the building industry, or doesn't give the building industry the appropriate kind of measures to take to finalize or occupancy, and to be able to, then further sell that property to another party. That process becomes more complicated without the final occupancy permit. And there's also like issues of safety around this, right? Because I'm not talking about, not occupancy permits being available online, but the very fact that occupancy permits do not exist. because that is exactly the opportunity that the municipality has to come in and, sign off on whether, the construction has been done according to the standards that were, or that according to the permit of the, according to the building permit, right? So this is the one opportunity after the final inspections that, the municipality has to sign off on that. So there are those issues as well. Um, so this leads me to the next point, right? What really drives digital maturity is not also just the existence of a portal, but whether agencies are connected behind the scenes. Only a small share of economies have full integration across relevant permitting functions. Many have either partial integration or no meaningful integration at all. For contractors, this distinction matters enormously, right? A portal can improve appearance and even basic access, but if planning, building, control, and environmental agencies are not interoperable, then much of coordination burden falls on the applicant, right? So in practical terms, delays can persist even when there's a system that looks digital, but from the outside, but is really not integrated. And so what does that mean, right? I mean, as a customer, you're still going to various agencies and still conducting interactions with them. So, and we observe that interagency platform integration remains limited across planning and building control systems. The same unevenness is visible in environmental permitting. Some regions perform relatively well across functions such as online submission, payment, and public participation, while others lag significantly, particularly on paper-free systems and online dispute filing. The broader point is that digital environmental services remain patchy. This matters because environmental clearances is often the part of the approval chain that is the least standardized from one market to another. So weak digital infrastructure here can create a major source of unpredictability, especially for projects with multiple reviews, consultation requirements, or supporting studies. If you look at mature systems rather than, isolated features, only few a small group of economies perform strongly across digital components. What is notable is that this group is not limited. I'm talking about for environmental permitting here. So countries are not limited to high-income economies. Countries such as Mauritius and Philippines show a strong digital environmental permitting is achievable outside the traditional high-income OECD context. This is an encouraging message. It suggests not purely a question of income level, it's also about institutional design, administrative prioritization, and implementation discipline. For industry, it means that expectations should be based on actual system performance, not simply on like a region or income category of what is available in terms of environmental permitting and digitalization. So here we're coming back to the building permit process, right? So this is especially relevant to project planning. Spatial plans and zoning data are often available online, but in most regions, they are not yet fully integrated into permit decision making. OECD income economies are the main exception. Elsewhere, firms may be able to view information, but the actual permit workflow still depends heavily on manual verification. For contractors, this means the existence of online maps does not necessarily reduce compliance uncertainty. In many markets, site compliance still has to be checked through additional administrative steps, consultations, or document submissions, even when the data infrastructure appears reasonably modern. So, that's still a bottleneck. Um, on transparency, the overall picture is mixed, right? So basic information such as building control regulations and permit requirements is often available online, which is good news. But more operationally useful information such as permit issuance statistics, prior approval lists, or occupancy permit documentation remains much less consistently available. This is where transaction uncertainty grows. For contractors, like transparency is not just about knowing the law, it's also about knowing the process, the likely steps, the likely bottlenecks. And when these details are missing, firms face higher search costs and more room for informal variation. And so One interesting contrast is that formal zoning modification procedures um, are much more common than recent master plan updates. So, in other words, many economies have a process for changing zoning, but the underlying strategic planning framework may be dated. This can create tension between static planning, baseline, and dynamic project demand. So, for contractors and developers, this matters because it can create reliance on case by case adjustment or exceptions rather than planning decisions grounded in recently updated urban strategies. So, in fast growing markets, this may translate into greater uncertainty at the interface between planning and permitting. Um, and then again, this is one of the more policy relevant findings. Across all income groups, transparency scores are higher than digital service scores. Low income economies, in particular, often do much better on transparency than on digitization. This is important because it shows reform does not have to wait for a full digital platform. Governments can take meaningful progress simply by publishing requirements, fee schedules, approved EIA lists, and process guidance online. For businesses, this kind of transparency can reduce uncertainty before a system becomes fully digital. So there's a clear sequencing lesson here. Publish first, digitize next. Now we come to the third pillar that we measure about operational efficiency. How long does it take? How much does it cost? Something along the lines of what doing business used to do. So this is we call this efficiency in the spread. So when we come to move to efficiency for in building permitting, the spread is very wide, right? So building permit timelines range from a matter of days to several years, with a global average of 112 days and a median of 75 days. So this is the time it takes from the time that you submit your permit application to the time that you receive the building permit application, the building permit itself. That variation tells us that firms entering a new market cannot infer process speed from formal rules alone, right? So two systems that look very similar on paper, but can perform very differently in practice. So therefore, I mean, we understand time is not a side issue, right? For contractors, there's financing, sequencing, procurement. So there is huge practical value of this data to separate nominal regulatory design to actual delivery performance. And and then costs, right? Permit costs also show major disparities, especially when expressed relative to income. So we measure cost as a percentage of GNI per capita. Lower income economies in South Asia stand out as places where the cost burden is especially high for firms. This matters because regulatory costs can materially shape project viability, especially for small developers and mid-sized contractors. It also it reinforces a broader point, right? The business environment challenge is not only delay, but also affordability and proportionality of compliance. And environmental permit timelines show another interesting pattern. On an average, they're longer in regions and systems with stronger or more structured environmental requirements, and which is counterintuitive, right? This should not automatically be read as a negative result. It reflects maybe that there is more of a substantive review. But from a project management standpoint, it underlines the need for early integration of environmental compliance into project preparation. When environmental processes are treated as an afterthought, they become a major source of delay and bottleneck. When they are anticipated early, firms are better positioned to manage both compliance and schedule risk. And then my last slide is on, costs for environment permits also vary sharply. The wide dispersion in sub-Saharan Africa and relatively lower and more consistent levels in Europe and Central Asia. This combination of high variance and extreme outliers is important for international contractors because it signals that environmental compliance costs are not only high in some markets, but also somewhat difficult to predict. The unpredictability can be problematic at as the level itself, right? I guess it can complicate many things like bidding and risk pricing. So, let me just close by three practical messages, right? First is that across the 101 countries that we assess, the legal foundation for building and environmental permitting are often in place. Second, the biggest gap is in accountability, transparency, and operational integration. And third, for contractors, the real dividing line is between easier and harder markets is often, I guess, not whether rules exist, but whether the system is navigable. predictable, and connected in practice. Thank you very much. I would encourage all of the CICA membership to engage with us, to participate in becoming our experts for this round, the future round of Business Ready. We rely on experts like you to provide us the inputs into our questionnaires so that you're able to inform the regulatory and public services landscape of your economy in this very influential report. Thank you very much. Over to you, Andy, and also to Victoria. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this very detailed and interesting presentation. And we will try to, we will do our best to identify some experts that would be willing and ready to fill out the forms for the next future Be Ready report. So maybe I will give the floor to Victoria, and then we'll do the questions at the end of the session.
Thank you very much, Andine. I'm just taking a moment to share my screen. Can you see the presentation on your screen?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for taking time to join our today's session. This part will cover the utility services, and this is one of the topics under the Be Ready report, and it covers the electricity, water, and internet. And we assess the services across 101 economies for the Be Ready 2025 report and over 160 economies for the upcoming 2026 report. And before diving into the individual utility assessment, we will start with the global overview. This section will look at the patterns and trends across all 101 economies to understand how countries are performing in aggregate and at what income levels, geography, and governance structures tell us about the service quality. Essentially, the Be Ready utility services topic is structured around the three pillars: regulatory quality, governance and transparency, and operational efficiency, each measuring a distinct dimension of how utility services function. And the categories under each pillar are assessed for the three utility services: electricity, water, and internet. So you can see that on this slide, some of the categories under the regulatory framework include the regulatory oversight of tariffs and service quality, requirements on coordination in utility connections and infrastructure development, regulations on safety of utility connections, and requirements on environmental sustainability. The Pillar 2, which measures the de facto measures, examines the governance and transparency across the four categories: digital services and interoperability, monitoring of service supply and practice, and availability of information, customer notification, and finally, the enforcement measures of safety regulations. And lastly, Pillar 3 on operational efficiency. It also measures de facto indicators, which are collected primarily through enterprise surveys, which is the firm level data, in combinations with expert consultations. And it measures the what businesses actually experience in practice across the three dimensions of affordability, time to obtain connection, and the reliability of supply. As I mentioned, the data collection approaches are have two modes: the experts consultation, which is primarily used for Pillar 1 and 2, and for operational efficiency, it is a combination of experts consultation and the firm level data. Now, looking at the big picture, the global average utility services score across 101 economies is 70.7 out of 100. This result reflects meaningful progress in many parts of the world, while still leaving significant room for improvement. And breaking this down by pillar, we can see that pillars are going hand in hand, scoring on par with each other. They're remarkably close in the global average scores, suggesting that regulatory governance and the regulatory and governance challenges are broadly aligned with the operational ones. You can also see the top 5 performers are Korea, Singapore, Latvia, Vietnam, and Spain. And notably, 55 out of 101 economies scored above 70, meaning more than half of economies in the sample globally have reached the global average score. though the distance from 70 to the frontier still remains substantial. And the evidence from the analysis of the scores by income group suggests that high-income economies outscore low-income peers across all the three pillars, and the gap is more than 30 points in the overall topic score. And the gap is largest in Pillar 2, governance and transparency, at over 39 points. And this tells us that the challenge is not just about building infrastructure, it is about building the institutions, the oversight systems, and information environments that can make services trustworthy and accountable. On this graph, you see the relationship between the GNI per capita and the utility service performance, and it is reinforced that high-income OECD economies cluster the top right, high-income, high scores, and sub-Saharan Africa economies mostly cluster the bottom left. As countries become wealthier, their scores improve, but the relationship is not mechanical. And there are definitely notable exceptions. There is meaningful variation around the trend line, meaning that some economies perform above or below the income level expectations. And this variation is exactly where BeReady adds value. It provides the diagnostic information needed to understand where the gaps are and where the existing practices are strong enough. An example of economies that are not, for example, high income, but perform above the income expectation in the topic are Vietnam, which scores 90 points in the overall US topic score, Colombia, Kazakhstan, Azerbaijan, Romania, Philippines are all the examples of economies that deviate from the trend line, and meaning that you don't need to be rich to perform well on the topic. And on this slide, you can see some of the highlights of the areas measured by utility services that are most relevant for the construction sector. And the two areas of consistent weakness across utility types are the cross-utility infrastructure coordination regulations and practices. On joint planning and construction, electricity indicators score slightly above half of maximum points with a global average of 54%. And water performs similarly at 53%. Regional breakdowns are particularly striking. South Asia averages 0 points for joint planning, and Latin America and the Caribbean averages only 23% of possible score. On coordination mechanism for excavation permits, electricity performs at 31% and water at 36% of maximum score on average. These are remarkably low figures globally for a mechanism that prevents costly and disruptive repeated road excavation. On the other hand, performance is good on the enforcement of safety regulation. Consumer protection and safety enforcement scores are high at 81% for internet, 79% for electricity, and 67% for water. Water's low enforcement score is consistent with the weaker governance performance across the board compared to the other utilities. And this slide looks at how economies across income groups regulate quality and oversight in water and electricity connection. We are tracking 3 specific safeguards: whether the licensed professionals handle external works, whether those same professionals verify quality, and whether a separate third party does a final inspection. A fourth bar captures economies where none of these practices exist. Under the utility services methodology, full points are awarded for either of the 2 scenarios. Licensed company handling the installation also performs the final check, or the third-party inspection is in place. Of course, many economies mandate all 3 requirements, and you can trace this on the graph, but we do not require all 3 practices to be simultaneously present. And the first thing to notice is that, for example, on the light blue bar, requirement for licensed professional company to carry out external work is already high even among low-income economies. For instance, 86% for water, 91% for electricity. That baseline reaches 93% for water and 96% for electricity in high-income economies. So the licensing requirement has indeed a good adoption level. The inspection requirement by the company that performed the installation follows closely across income groups, sometimes trailing behind like 13% gap in low-income economies for water, meaning that licensing requirements exist, but the company is not required to perform checks at the end. Or in case of low-income economies for electricity, for example, the trend is reversed, that inspections are mandated by installing company, but licensing might be lacking, resulting into a 9% gap in low-income economies for electricity, but in a reverse direction. The notable gap in the adoption of safety regulation is that 13% of economies in the low-middle income group lack any of the best practices for water and 3% for electricity. Utility infrastructure such as poles, ducts, or pipes tends to be expensive and requires a long time to construct. And in this regard, regulations and standards that can promote sharing the same infrastructure among different utility providers, including those encouraging common excavation plans or dig once policies, enhance interoperability and lessen the time and cost that are required to receive the utility connection. Joint planning and construction regulations are globally significantly less common in water, with 52.5% adopting economies, and electricity, with 56.9% of adopting economies, as compared to internet, where 73.3% of economies are adopting such regulations. Economies with joint planning enable cost sharing for excavation and construction, reducing duplication. High-income economies lead in the adoption of joint planning and construction regulations in water and electricity, but upper-middle-income economies perform better in internet. Internet, in fact, is the only utility for which majority of low-income economies have adopted joint planning and construction regulations. These are lacking for water and in close to 3/4 of low-income economies. Online excavation permit coordination, where utilities can obtain and coordinate permits digitally, is critical for minimizing disruption and cost. And the global averages are notably low for this area. Internet stands at around 24%, electricity is slightly above 20%, and water is even below 20%. In high-income economies, OECD high-income economies, they lead in the adoption of online system for excavation permit coordination with an average of 62% for internet connections. Sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, and LAC, Latin America and Caribbean, reflect most room for improvement in the adoption of interoperability tools. For example, online excavation permits for electricity and water infrastructure are absent among all economies in South Asia, and the adoption rate in Sub-Saharan Africa is below 5% across utilities. The absence of digital coordination mechanism lead to repeated excavation, longer disruptions, and unnecessary costs for businesses and governments alike. Knowing where the infrastructure is located is fundamental to managing it safely and efficiently. The global adoption rates for infrastructure databases across utilities are for water 53%, for internet slightly below 40%, and electricity again slightly below 40%. Water has the strongest performance compared to electricity and internet, likely reflecting the long history of underground water mapping for public safety and engineering purposes. Building and maintaining these databases requires investment and interagency coordination, but they are foundational capability for every other coordination mechanism. You cannot share infrastructure or coordinate excavation permit if you do not know where the infrastructure is located. And high-income OECD economies show the strongest infrastructure database coverage, particularly for water utilities, reflecting investment in digital asset management and regulatory requirements. South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa show consistently low adoption across all three utility types, highlighting where investment in infrastructure data system is mostly urgently needed. Electricity databases in Sub-Saharan Africa remain especially underdeveloped, despite rapid urbanization, posing a challenge for grid planning and resilience. Platforms that publish information on planned utility works allow businesses and the public to anticipate disruption and plan accordingly. The global averages show how much room for improvement exists. Overall, adoption of platforms with information on planned utility works is most common for water, standing at close to 40%, followed by electricity with 35.6%, and internet standing at 22.8%. High-income economies are the only group where the platform with information on planned utility works has been adopted in most economies for each of the three utilities. Whereas low-income economies is the group where the adoption of platforms with information on planned utility works varies the most across the three utilities. For electricity, the share of economies employing such practice is even higher than in the upper middle-income economy group, while the practice is absent for internet. The income divide is dramatic. For internet, not a single low-income economy in our sample has platform published information on planned internet infrastructure works. Even for water, at 9%, only a tiny fraction of low-income economies offer this transparency. This is one of the more traceable reforms available. The technology is widely available, and the cost of publishing planned works online is relatively low. The policy action is institutional, and it is related to the willingness to commit to transparency and the coordination needed to aggregate information across multiple providers and the agencies. And now I'll present a few findings related specific to the electricity and then specific to the water area. Electricity performs reasonably well across all three pillars, standing at around the similar numbers, from 23 to 25 points out of maximum of 33. And these are among the strongest scores in the BREDI dataset, reflecting decades of electricity sector reforms globally. However, the operational efficiency, cost, time, and reliability combined scores by income group reveal a sharp divide. For low-income economies, the score is standing at 15.4%, and for high-income group, for example, it stands at 28%. The gap 28 points out of maximum of 33 points. The gap between the low-income and high-income operational efficiency represent fundamentally different business realities. For a firm operating in a low-income economy, unreliable electricity is not an inconvenience, it is a core constraint to production, growth, and profitability. On this slide, you can see the Pillar 1 categories for electricity, and they show a clear hierarchy of regulatory maturity. Monitoring of tariffs and service quality is at close to 90% of maximum score, the strongest performing subcategory globally, and safety regulations is also demonstrating strong performance, reflecting well-established safety frameworks. Going further, infrastructure sharing categories are at 70% of global average score, with moderate performance and showcasing still significant room for improvement. And the weakest dimension is environmental sustainability. This is the clearest area for reform. And 54% on environmental sustainability signals that while countries have built the basic architecture of electricity regulation, far fewer have integrated meaningful environmental standards, whether for grid efficiency, renewable energy, or financial sanctions for non-compliance. And similar slide for Pillar 2. Pillar 2 is the transparency and governance frameworks of the utility services. It reveals a significant variation across governance dimensions, with monitoring of service global average score standing at over 83%, being the strongest dimension. Availability of information global average score standing at 75% of the maximum score, again reflecting relatively strong performance. Enforcement of safety regulation and consumer protection mechanisms is also standing at 79%. In the meantime, the digital services and interoperability has a global average of just 49% of maximum score, which makes it the weakest dimension by a significant margin. And this is, again, one of the most traceable reforms available within this subcategory. The indicators on information on existing infrastructure and planned works, as well as coordination mechanisms for excavation permits, lag at average global scores of 0.76 and 0.65 out of maximum of 2 points. The environmental provisions are among the weak areas of electricity regulatory framework, with global average score at 4.48 out of 8.33. The uptake of regulations on the environmental sustainability of electricity use at the demand side lags behind the supply side regulations. Demand side regulations requirements placed on businesses to adopt energy efficient practices scored at only 47% of maximum, while supply side regulations scored 60%. This means that even where sustainability is regulated, it tends to focus on the supply side and leave businesses' behavior relatively unconstrained. High-income economies are significantly more likely to require businesses to switch to energy efficient practices compared to low-income economies. This reflects both institutional capacity gaps and policy priority differences. Only 36% of low-income economies have financial sanctions for non-compliance with energy efficiency requirement, compared to 65% in high-income settings. Financial sanctions are one of the most effective tools for driving behavior change. Their absence means that even where energy efficiency regulation exists on paper, they often lack the enforcement mechanism to change the practice. And while some of these practices, such as financial incentives, require generous fiscal capacity, others seem more tangible yet strikingly under-implemented, such as only 18% of low-income economies publishing environmental sustainability indicators compared to 73% of high-income economies. Both regulatory and implementation indicators show significant room for improvement, suggesting that environmental sustainability regulations and their monitoring remain one of the key areas for reform. And this slide presents a snapshot of operational efficiency indicators for electricity, and the graph shows the time to obtain electrical connections and the number of outages experienced by firm in each region. The data is collected from enterprise surveys on these indicators. As concerns reliability, high-income countries average just 0.24 outages per month, compared to 10.4 outages per month in low-income countries, pointing to a structural constraint on investment and growth that firms in low-income economies experience. The connection time, however, tells a different story. High-income economies take longer to obtain electricity connection, on average 52.5 days, much longer than low-income economies. This reflects more complex, multi-step regulated processes in advanced economies. But while the economies need to ensure that all safety, environmental, and other connection quality requirements are met, which we measure in utility services in our regulatory framework pillar, it is important that in practice the processes to obtain connections as experienced by firms are still efficient and fast. And this brings me to the findings related to the water utility. We'll take a look at the water pillar scores, and we'll again see the trend of them being uniformly distributed across the three pillars, and they're also uniformly lower than electricity across all the three pillars. The performance on pillar 1 and pillar 2 accounts for about 2/3 of the maximum score on each pillar, whereas pillar 3 performs slightly higher. The operational efficiency score by income group shows a similar step ladder pattern to electricity, but starting from a lower base. The average score on operational efficiency in high-income economies is almost twice as high as that in low-income setting. And similar slide for pillar 1 shows the breakdown of the following pattern. The monitoring of tariffs and service quality is the strongest subcategory, consistent with the pattern seen in electricity. Safety regulations also performing relatively well, with 70% adoption rate. Infrastructure sharing area demonstrates moderate performance, standing at 62%. At that, coordination requirements for excavation scoring only 36% of maximum score. Environmental sustainability is the weakest dimension, 55% of the total score. For water, environmental sustainability encompasses a broader set of obligations, not just water-saving practices, but also wastewater management, water quality standards, and discharge regulations. The average global score of 55 out of maximum on this subcategory means that in nearly majority of economies assessed, these are critical regulatory requirements either absent or incomplete. The implications extend well beyond the business environment. Inadequate water sustainability regulation creates long-term supply risks that will eventually constrain business activity. For the second pillar on governance and transparency of utility services, you can see that the breakdowns of categories highlights the clear strength and clear weakness areas. Monitoring a service supply with 82% of maximum score globally, the highest subcategory score in the entire pillar. Availability of information and enforcement subcategories show moderate performance at 69 and 67% of maximum score respectively, and digital services and interoperability stands at 47%, the weakest governance dimension, even lower than electricity, which stands at 49%. The 82% of maximum score on monitoring of service supply is encouraging. Many economies have invested in tracking water supply quality and quantity, but 47% of digital service is a significant gap in digital accessibility for businesses. On applications, electronic billing and integration with other utilities remain exception. Modernizing the digital interface of water utilities is a high impact and relatively achievable reform that can build a monitoring foundation that already exists. This slide shows a snapshot of key operational efficiency indicators for water. The cost of connection and service has the highest score of 80% of maximum, followed by reliability of water supply standing at 70%, and finally the time to obtain connection stands below 60% mark. The time to obtain water connection follows similar pattern to electricity, where the median number of days to connect rises from 10.4 days in low-income economies to 32.75 days in high-income economies, again reflecting more complex and regulated connection process in advanced economies. In contrast, reliability in terms of actual supply disruption remains the core challenge in low-income economies, where firms frequently cope with water shortages through costly workarounds. The reliability gap between low-income at 21.5% of firms experience water insufficiency, and high income, only 4% of firms experience water insufficiency, is stark, and this divide is consequential. And this brings me to the last two slides with key takeaways, both for electricity and water. Just to wrap it up, for electricity, we see that there is a balance, but it is still below potential. On all three pillars, electricity scores are on par. Most economies have basic frameworks, but lack depth in infrastructure sharing and coordination regulations and practices, as well as environmental sustainability frameworks and practices. Infrastructure sharing remains underdeveloped. The score on joint planning and construction for electricity averages a slightly over half of maximum score. Coordination for excavation permits exhibits an even larger gap between average performance and best practices, with a mean score standing at 31% of total score. Regulatory monitoring requirements are widely adopted. Most economies already perform well in regulatory monitoring of tariffs and service quality. In particular, economies employing monitoring of tariffs and monitoring of service quality. Reliability gap tracks income. Connection time tells a different story. Reliability of electricity supply shows income correlated gap, indeed, as we've seen in the previous slides, while the connection time is longer in high income group compared to low income group, reflecting more complex multi-step regulated processes in high income settings. And while economies need to ensure all regulatory standards are met for safety or environment, it is important that businesses must receive efficient and timely connection processing and practice as well. Environmental provision is lagging behind the uptake of regulations on the environmental sustainability of electricity use for the demand side, lags behind the supply side regulation. And finally, transparency improves across limited areas. With the mean score on availability of information and transparency at 75% of the maximum, the improvement is primarily driven by increasing provision of information on plan outages, while it is hindered by low access to connection requirements and sustainability indicators. And key takeaways for water are such that water trails electricity across all pillars, with scores being 1 to 2 points lower than electricity across the 3 pillars. The joint planning and construction is the area with significant room for improvement. Global average score stands at 53% of maximum score, with some regions showcasing critical gaps, for example, South Asia, which averages at 0. And consumer protection and safety norms enforcement is weakest for water. The global average score on enforcement of safety regulation and consumer protection mechanisms stands at 2/3 of the total score. It is significantly lower than the consistent high scores of electricity and internet, both around 80%. Efficiency indicators versus income, we observe similar trends to electricity, while reliability of water supply is higher and in high-income economies, the connection times are shorter in low-income economies. And the environmental sustainability frameworks for water remain underdeveloped. Water sustainability provisions average less than 55% of maximum score globally. Water saving requirements and incentives are key areas with an uneven uptake. And finally, the monitoring of service supply subcategory is among the few where water does not lag behind electricity and internet, and where it performs above the 80% threshold, where the global average score is at 81 or close to 82% of the total. And this brings me to the end of the presentation. Thank you very much for your attention, and we're ready to answer any questions that you may have. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Victoria, and thank you again, Jayashri, for this really interesting and presentation. Many information were shared, so we will need to digest all. But maybe I will directly open the floor for some questions, if the audience has some. So you can either type your question in the chat or just open your microphone and maybe just state your country or company. If we don't have immediate questions, maybe I will ask one myself. So you reminded us that the team of the Be Ready provides guidance to governments as well from those indicators and from the data you collect. Do you also assess the implementation and the enforcement on the government side from, first you collect the data and then you see if they changed or evolve over time from the guidance you provide?
I can take this. Thank you, Andy. No, I want to clarify one thing. We don't provide the way we engage with governments is that we clarify to them what we measure, how we measure it, and the methodology part and the data, right? So they have any questions. Oh, why did I score so poorly on this? So we break it down to them and tell them, you got this much because you don't have this provision or this law or this feature. So we explain the data to them and explain methodology to them. But we do not provide advice to them as to how they can improve, right? So because we cannot be the evaluator and the, advisors, because there's a conflict of interest there. So, there's a Chinese wall, so we do all the measurement and the data side. And then we have teams in the World Bank who work directly with clients if they're interested in, helping them implement reforms, new regulations, or, online processes, for instance. In terms of capturing what has changed, so this is still a relatively new project, Be Ready. So this is our second cycle, right? Be Ready 2025. And in December of this year, we will publish Be Ready 2026, which will have 160 countries. All the 101 that were in Be Ready 2025, plus 59 more. So we'll have 160 countries, and we publish that in December of 2026. So then we would have somewhat of a time series. So after 2026, it will be the same countries every year annually. So that is where when we'll have, the time series established for all these countries. And then at that point, yes, we hope to measure in the data changes, right? So like, for instance, any new law that is implemented, or because of all these reforms, the time taken to obtain something has reduced, for instance, that becomes very apparent in our data when you compare, in a time series. But we don't have that yet, but that's where we're moving towards. And that's where we also see increased value add for our clients within the bank, outside the bank, for policymakers and even private sector, no? To see,
Yeah,
things that like,
definitely.
this is good news, things are improving, right?
Thank you. It's really clear. So I don't see any other hands raised, so maybe I have a second question. You mentioned the methodology that you're using to collect the data. How do you ensure the comparability of the data across the countries and the cities? Because we have a really wide pool of countries with different legislations, regulations. So how do you manage to do that?
I can take this
I
and
can
maybe
take-
Victoria. Oh, go ahead, Victoria, go ahead.
Okay, sure. No, thank you very much for the question. I think the data comparability is indeed one of the cornerstones of the Be Ready project, as it used to be for doing business as well, because the coverage extends for now for business ready for over 160 economies. So it is indeed important to ensure that the methodology is developed such that the data is comparable. And essentially, the two data collection methods that are used are data is collected through expert consultations and the data is collected through from-level surveys. How the data comparability is achieved for the expert consultations, for example, the efficiency indicators on time and cost in many topics, they have scenarios that are developed and in such way that they would be applicable for all the economies, so they could be more relevant for some settings and slightly less relevant for others, but they still would need to remain relevant across all. And this is what's pertaining to expert consultation. Now, for the firm level data, the data is collected from a stratified random sample of firms, and this ensures that the data that is of course representative to make sure that the firms are of different sizes and in different locations of the country that are captured. So this ensures that the data is representative and capturing and reflecting accurately the picture of a country and can be used as a proxy for the country dimension. And of course, this is also by applying and deploying the same methods across the countries. This is how the comparability of the data is achieved in the case of firm-level surveys as well. Jayashree, please feel free to add anything.
I think you covered it all extensively.
Thank you very much, Victoria. It's really helpful. Do we have any questions or reactions from the audience? You can just open your mic or write the question in the chat. Okay, so maybe before closing, I don't know if you would like to advertise again the possibility to be an expert. Maybe it will allow them to share it to their networks.
Yes. So a large part, all our data basically comes from private sector, right? We don't, we do get governments to complete a questionnaire, but that's just to validate our data. But the actual, primary data comes from governments for Pillar 1 and Pillar 2, and most of Pillar 3 as well for business location. So basically, that means that, we rely on experts like CICA members to really give us inputs into our questionnaire on what is, what are the regulatory framework in that country that they work in, what are the public services, and what is happening in practice. So without your help, it would be very difficult for us. And I'm sure we have already individually reached out to experts who are relevant to us, and they might be part of CICA, but then, we would like to do like a, concerted effort through CICA to be able to reach out to contractors, engineers, building construction professionals who can participate in our report, and your inputs are what really make this report stronger. And they also then go into influencing policymakers in making real changes to what are the bottlenecks, right? So all the things that you complain about, and there are bottlenecks for you, this is your opportunity to engage with us and show us. I mean, include that in the inputs that you provide, and that can then inform. It's a very influential report. Governments read it very closely, carefully. They want to see how they score. And this is shown by, when they interact with us, they really go down to like each question and say, why did we get a point here? So they're like looking every question, and then they want to understand why they did not score on something. And, that's our opportunity to tell them, hey, you don't have this feature. That's why, so, and that comes from experts like you, the data, right? So it's really like I would it's everybody's best interest that we get good quality data, and we get inputs from experts like you. Thank you.
Thank you. We will do our best to identify some experts. I will share along with the replay of this webinar this opportunity, and hopefully someone will reach out.
Thank you.
Well, if we don't have any reactions or questions, I think we will be closing this session. Thank you everyone for joining us today. I hope you found the presentation interesting and the discussion fruitful. Thank you again, Jayashri and Victoria, for joining us and for presenting. I hope we can make it an annual rendezvous, maybe,
For sure.
if you would be great. And so the replay will be available in a few days on CICA's YouTube channel. So don't hesitate to share it and to ask questions in the comment section. Well, thank you very much, everyone, and have a good day or a good afternoon.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.